Hey, hi. I'm not sure if it's afternoon or morning when you're viewing this, but hello to the South African Archaeological Society, and thank you so much for to Vaughn and Nick for asking me to present. I presented, I think, back in 2019 in Cape Town, and I really enjoyed that experience. And it was great to get to meet so many of you, and so it's really quite an honor and quite a pleasure to be able to speak to you again today. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about diverse social connections and social landscapes across past forager contexts in Southern Africa. So I guess to summarize that, what we're looking at is just how past peoples and past foraging peoples were able to stay connected, were able to interact with one another, were able to form new friendships, new connections, and maintain these connections over both really long distances and also through really long periods of time. And when we're talking about time and we're thinking about, we're thinking about this from our own context today, we're able to kind of make new friends and kind of keep in touch with them through, years and years and years. And even without seeing them or talking to them or kind of being in their presence, in their physical presence. And this is a lot of it has to do with, the internet, social media, things like that, hence the add as friend little image there. But being human is being social, right? All humans interact with other humans pretty much. It's something that the vast majority of humans crave. So I think one of the interesting things to think about is from our context now, even during the pandemic, we were able to stay connected and interact with one another through WhatsApp, through things like this, virtual recordings, through Zoom, etc., through telephone calls. But how would this have happened in the past? And was this important in the past? So I think that's those are kind of some of the key themes that we're going to think about and talk about in this talk. And we'll talk about them in the Southern African context and specifically from the context or from some of the data and the information that we're getting from the archaeological research that's being conducted at Grassridge, which is the site I kind of talked about before, and where my colleague Chris Ames and myself are kind of building off Hermanus Opperman's early research and trying to see how this site and more broadly the region fits into what's happening in different parts of Southern Africa, probably from I guess the terminal Pleistocene MIS2 or marine isotope stage 2 up to the present. So just going to go to the next slide here. And before we get into it, I'm presenting or recording this talk from the University of Manitoba campuses. And I want to provide a traditional territories acknowledgement. So the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. And this is, incredibly important for myself as a white settler academic at the University of Manitoba, and especially with everything that's going on in terms of the residential school burials and the ongoing process of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. So I want to talk a little bit about social connections and just kind of like what is a social connection. And I know it sounds pretty straightforward. It's how you interact with someone, but it's also really important to think about social connections aren't just with other people. They can also be with objects, with things, with landscapes, with the environment. It's super interesting to think about it, but there's different environments or landscapes or areas that you kind of feel an attachment to. And it could be, a fondness or maybe not so, not so happy about it. And it's the same with objects or things, material things. They almost kind of tend to take up a life of their own. Maybe you have a favorite pen, and it doesn't necessarily write better or worse than any other pen, but the way you came about it or something has meaning there, and that's a connection, and that's something that's also really important to think about when we're thinking about ostrich eggshell beads, and when we're thinking about stone tools, and when we're thinking about the process and the social context in which these things are made and used. And it's the same today as it was in the past. So there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of similarities or kind of through lines there. One of the interesting things to think about, though, is that, at least based on the archaeology, it seems that the nature of these interactions or these social connections, these connections between other people, between environments, landscapes, objects, things, intensifies through time. And I'm talking about long time here in terms of like hominin evolution. So with some of the earliest hominins, I mean, they may be interacting or have specific attachments with different things, but it's really hard to pick up in the archaeological record. As we come further forward through time, we start to see kind of the presence of a whole variety of different kinds of artifacts. We start to see materials and things that are made in one place and then end up in the archaeological record, 400 or 500 kilometers away. So these objects and artifacts have kind of their own life histories, and they must have interacted and connected with people in order to get from, where they were found to where they ended up. And so I think, in terms of thinking about social connections, it's really important to not forget that when we're thinking about the archaeology, because I think it's all too easy to kind of get wrapped up in, oh, this is an artifact, or it's a scraper, or it's an ostrich eggshell bead that has a diameter of 4.5 millimeters or something like that. But these are actual things that people made and they used and they talked about and they shared and they interacted with, and they formed a focus of interaction. And in that interaction, what we see is, these social connections. So I think it's really important to kind of keep those social connections in the backs of our minds as we're looking at the archaeology, and to not sort of lose sight of it or put it off to the side. So I guess part of the argument here is that the study of social connections is really fundamental to archaeology. A lot of archaeology, globally, and no matter what time period you're looking at, is looking at how people were connecting with their environment, how they were making things, how they were connecting with objects, and how they were connecting with each other. And then how these connections, the kind of like diverse matrix of connections changed through time, and why these connections may have changed through time. And so I think ostrich eggshell beads provide, insight into past social connections, both within and between groups. And they're pretty unique in that there's some ethnographic and historical accounts that document the exchange of ostrich eggshell beads among foragers as a way to, or at least ostrich eggshell bead jewelry, as a way to form and maintain, connections. And this is something that we also start to see further back in the past with the production of ostrich eggshell beads and some of the differences, the typological or technological differences in bead diameter, maybe reflecting different kinds of cultural preferences, and the movement of beads themselves, or ostrich eggshell itself, over, 50, 100, 200, 300 kilometers. So today we'll be really focusing on Grassridge and kind of some of the surrounding region. And I'll be sharing some insights from some of the recent research some of the recent kind of results we've got from the ongoing analyses at Grassridge. And I'll also talk a little bit about a paper that was recently published in PLOS ONE by Amy Hatton with myself as a co-author, as well as Ben Scoville and Jane Wilkins. And that paper is open access. So I'm sure we can send out a link, or if you would like a copy, I'm going to leave my email address at the end of the presentation here. So Grassridge Rockshelter is located in the Eastern Cape, and I'll provide a bit of background on it here. So it's located between Sturkstrom and Dordrecht. And the site was initially excavated by Hermanus Opperman in 1979. And then my colleague Chris and I, I went out there and took a look in 2014. And then my colleague Chris and I were very fortunate to get a little bit of funding, and we went out there and decided to kind of renew or start excavation there, and see, to kind of build off what Mani Opperman had found. And so you can see the image there. There's a white bucky kind of in the background, and that's for scale. And then the shelter itself is just kind of below this ridge, and it's overgrown. It's shaded or kind of hidden by those I guess little trees, scrub, foliage, etc. And then just off to the left of the image there, which is out of picture, there's a stream that kind of comes down and is cutting through some of that bedrock. On the left is a schematic drawing of what the shelter looks like, and we were able to map this out the first year. And so everyone can see it's a massive rock shelter. It's over 40 square meters. It faces southeast, and just below the drip line there at the talus, there's archaeology all the way around. And it's all kind of eroded out, or all of the sediment is washed away, so it's a palimpsest, so the different layers have conflated. But there's stone tool artifacts just all around there, which is a really good indication that the whole shelter was used. And it's also a really good indication that it was used quite intensively. And so that's really exciting. And then you can see we've only excavated a teeny tiny little bit of it here. So in the light gray with the orange, that's Hermanus Opperman's, or that's Mani Opperman's initial excavation. And then the three darker squares there, that's where Chris, myself, and our colleagues have been working since 2014. So one of the things that we did is we found, or were able to identify, Mani's original excavation trench. And then because we wanted to kind of build off his work and have this connection, so we left a 1 meter bulk between the two. And then we decided to clean off this section in orange there. And then we've taken a whole suite of both chronological, geological, sedimentary aDNA samples from this section. And of course, Chris and I didn't wait for the students to arrive before we took out all the backfill, which is one of the many rookie errors that we did. So this is what that orange section looks like. And initially, we had a whole suite of radiocarbon and optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL dates, from the top to the bottom. And so the white here, just go back a little bit. So the white here, these are Mani Opperman's original stratigraphic layers, and we've been kind of working through it. And it turns out that basically everything up the top until kind of this line here and the red line there dates to probably about 7,300 to 6,700 years ago. So this is 600 years of sediment accumulation. And so that's about 60 centimeters of sediment, which is a huge amount. So this kind of mid-Holocene component is incredibly, anthropogenic. You can see the ashy sediment here, and it's really dense in artifacts. And there's a hearth feature. You can kind of see all of the, the white lines, or the white kind of strata there. And this hearth feature extended probably from, if you're looking here, over that 1 meter kind of bulk, and then into our excavation as well. So the hearth feature, or I shouldn't, this hearth, it's a massive reused area, was probably at least 2 meters in diameter. So there's a really intensive focus of this in this part of the shelter. And then we have a terminal Pleistocene, kind of very early Holocene occupation here. And we had initially thought that it was only on kind of this part of the excavation. But it turns out we actually got, I think, about 10 new radiocarbon dates from this side of the excavation last week. And they demonstrate that this kind of little hearth feature here is also part of the terminal Pleistocene, or very early Holocene. And that dates from about 13,500 years ago to about 11,000 years ago. And then this thick black line here is a piece of flowstone. So it's an interesting kind of unconformity, and everything below this dates the late Pleistocene, so from about 30,000 years ago to about 43,000 years ago. And of course, there's archaeology the whole way down, which is really exciting. All right, so here's a map of the sites. So there's Grassridge and the Star, and then some of the other sites around it. So it's located in the Highveld grasslands in the Eastern Cape. And as I mentioned, it's got three major occupation, or there's kind of three big occupations, or I guess during this sequence. So the first one, or the earliest one, is the late Pleistocene. Then we have this terminal Pleistocene, which kind of follows, and then this really dense, intensive occupation during the mid-Holocene. And we'll be focusing on the terminal Pleistocene and the mid-Holocene here, because those are the only occupations from which we've recovered ostrich eggshell beads so far. So there's a couple of really interesting things about where Grassridge sits. Currently, so it's in the Highveld grassland here. But you can see it's really close to the border of a couple of different things, right? So up there, that's Drakensberg grassland, which is a little bit, higher elevation. A little bit further to the west, we have that Miesig Highveld grassland, which gets a little bit more moisture, then a little bit to the further west is the Upper Karoo. So there's some really interesting things going on where Grassridge sits, and it's really important to know that, or to remember that this vegetation map is for the present. So as we go back in time, these are going to change, right? And it's going to shift across. So when it was drier, the Karoo would expand. When it was moister, we might see kind of some of the other kind of more moisture intensive grasslands come into this region. So in that respect, Grassridge is really kind of situated at the crossroads, or at the boundary between a couple of different environmental biomes, or a couple of different kind of ecologies. And that means that there's a lot of different things for the past occupants, or the past peoples at Grassridge, to go out and get, right? So it makes it a pretty attractive place, because there's a lot of variety in a fairly kind of short area. Okay. So as I was saying before, there's really rich artifact assemblages. So we have lots of artifacts from all three of the occupations there, and especially from the mid-Holocene. And I can't emphasize how dense the artifacts are. As we're excavating, the fauna is popping up, lithics are popping up, ostrich eggshell and ostrich eggshell beads are popping up. And it's so dense that it really it slows us down when we're excavating, which is a very very good a very good issue to have. So for the talk today, we're really interested in are these ostrich eggshell and other bead assemblages. So for the ostrich eggshell beads and for the ostrich eggshell preforms, and preforms are unfinished beads, or beads that are in the process of being made, we see in the mid-Holocene over 1,100 total beads. And this combines the data from both Opperman's and our excavations. But this is a huge number of beads. And again, this mid-Holocene, this occurred over a 600-year period. So 1,181 total beads. And there's, there's probably more as we kind of expand out. And of these, we have 302 finished beads. But the majority of them are preforms or in the process of being made. So we don't consider them to be finished or complete beads. So this is a really strong indicator that the manufacture or the production of ostrich eggshell beads was an important activity at Grassridge during the mid-Holocene. As we go further back in time to the terminal Pleistocene, and just a little caveat is we haven't kind of updated the counts yet with those new dates, and kind of refiguring the stratigraphy. So the numbers may change a little bit in terms, there may be a couple less mid-Holocene beads and a couple more terminal Pleistocene beads. But from what we did have, we had 37 total beads from the terminal Pleistocene, 9 finished, and then 28 preforms, or in the process of being produced. And again, there's kind of a strong preference, or what we're finding are a lot of preforms. And these preforms are again indicating that the manufacture, the making or production of ostrich eggshell beads was really another kind of important part of what was happening at Grassridge during the terminal Pleistocene. The other cool thing that we see are these marine shell beads. And you all saw that Grassridge is nowhere near the coast. So these marine shell beads are very strong indicators that someone collected these shells from the coast, and then they were brought to Grassridge, either by an individual who was moving quite long distances, kind of across the course of their I guess what they were doing, their life way, or through exchange and trade with other groups and kind of moving further inland in that respect. And during the mid-Holocene, we have 13 in total, and during the terminal Pleistocene, we have 3 in total. And then here's some nice images of some of the beads. So these are the ostrich eggshell beads up the top in various stages of manufacture. So we have kind of the big chunk of ostrich eggshell, then the hole is drilled, and then it's rounded out and smooth, or chipped away and then kind of rounded out and smooth into the desired bead form. And then down the bottom is another kind of nice, this is super interesting too, because all of these beads have ochre around the aperture, which is suggestive that they would have been worn or strung. But you can see they're much more, I don't know what the technical term is, but like knobbly than like what we consider to be finished ostrich eggshell beads, like this one and this one. And so that's really interesting because it forces us to think about the categories that we're using. Like, are the categories, are what we consider to be a complete bead something that was actually considered to be a complete bead 7,000, 15,000 years ago? Or is there more diversity in what we were seeing? But I like showing this because these 6 beads were all found really close together. And they look, they're all pretty interesting in sharing that kind of knobbly characteristic and having the ochre around the aperture. And so these are the some of the marine shell beads that we recovered. So this is Natica, which is kind of a small sea snail. This is a piece of abalone with a hole drilled in it there. And then this is a limpet. And we're not 100% sure if there's like use wear on the limpet, but the fact that limpets come from the coast and then it was brought to the site is a pretty strong indicator that it was of some importance. There was a connection with this object. And then down at the bottom are 4 Necerius beads that we have from, and we have Necerius beads in both the terminal Pleistocene and the mid-Holocene. And so it's really interesting to kind of look at, again, there's a lot of ochre in the aperture, and we can see pretty clearly that they were drilled, and this one here was exposed to some heat. So, that's kind of the background on the beads, but I think it's also important to think about, beads and how they were used in social contexts, right? So the first thing to think of is like, why and how are beads being made? What's the social context of bead production? And as we can see here, and this is an interesting image, but it demonstrates just how many beads need to be produced in order to make jewelry. And it's also really important to remember that it's not the individual beads themselves that are being exchanged, but it's the jewelry. So the headbands, the wristbands, clothing with beads sewn onto it, things like that. So there's a lot of time and effort going into producing these, very intricate, beautiful pieces of jewelry that are, worn and used for culturing the body and for kind of representing who individuals are, and providing kind of that social context. And then these pieces of jewelry are exchanged and between different individuals, and it's another way to form these social connections. But even then, kind of thinking back to how beads are made, so typically, or what we see from the ethnography and the historical accounts is it's generally, they're made kind of in a group of people who are sitting around and chatting about it. There's a bunch of ostrich eggshell. People are kind of getting the fragments, drilling the hole through, kind of perforating the shell, starting to chip away at the excess, and then tying them onto a piece of cordage or string and kind of smoothing them in terms of smoothing them against a rough stone or something else. So this is the practice, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff happening there, because people are probably spending, at least at Grassridge, with the amount of like beads and preforms that we're finding, and if we're thinking about that as like a minimum, for everything else that didn't make it through the process of preservation, taphonomy, et cetera, and we didn't recover, people are spending a lot of time together. And it's, people are sitting around and they're doing this together. And it's really important because it provides an opportunity for social connection, right? It provides an opportunity to kind of form and maintain these social bonds, to strengthen them. And it also provides an opportunity for learning, and especially with, with kids. So not only are they learning how to make ostrich eggshell beads, but they're also learning the whole social and cultural context about why. So in this respect, the production of ostrich eggshell beads is like a teachable moment, but it provides a context for teaching, and in a space that's kind of really low stakes. There's not too much, like you're not going to get really injured or anything like that. And so it allows for this really important knowledge, not just about how to make ostrich eggshell beads, but what they mean, where they come from, how they fit into kind of the broader culture, cosmology, etc. And it also allows for, these conversations about kind of diversity in bead style, right? And so one of the things that quite a few recent papers have demonstrated, putting Jen Miller and Yinming Wang's paper in Nature, is that it looks like there's changes in bead style and especially bead diameter are present going back quite a long period, and they're linked to different, potentially different social groups. And so that's really interesting to think about, is these kind of group preferences or cultural preferences for different bead styles, bead diameters, shapes, etc. And this is also being discussed and passed down and to the next generation, to other people who are making these beads. So yeah, as I was saying, no complete beaded jewelry has been recovered from kind of archaeological contexts in the deep, more than I guess, if we're looking at kind of this time period, like the mid-Holocene further back, which is really challenging, because it would be incredibly interesting to see how these beads are fashioned into jewelry 5,000, 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 years ago. Are they being made similar, or are they being made, and is the jewelry look like? What does it look like? How are they being made? Are there differences? Are there things that we're missing? So those are all things that are really important. However, what we can do is we can study individual beads. And as I was just mentioning, variation in bead diameter is inferred to indicate or link to cultural diversity and variation. And there's a couple of papers there. Again, I'm happy to pass them on if you're interested. But they all these papers kind of are pretty important in terms of demonstrating distinction in bead diameter, and then cultural variability across a landscape. And of course, the most kind of probably the best known is Leon Jacobson, when he was initially discussing the differences between pastoralists who have generally quite large beads, and then foraging peoples who have beads that are significantly smaller. So at Grassridge, to reiterate and to try and form this into something that's a little bit more cohesive, beads are being made both during the terminal Pleistocene and the mid-Holocene, which is really cool, and it demonstrates that Grassridge is important, or an important place on the landscape for the manufacture of ostrich eggshell beads. We also find a lot of ostrich eggshell fragments at Grassridge during both time periods. And from what we've recovered and analyzed so far, there's at minimum a couple of eggs present in each occupation. One of the other really cool things that we see is the presence of actual ostrich bone. And we're working with Bakara Sprite at WITS, who's just finishing up her master's at the moment. And her master's focused on using zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry to analyze some of the unidentifiable bone fragments at Grassridge. And so this technique, it's destructive, but it kind of takes part of the bone, grinds it down into a powder, and then it extracts the proteins and the collagens, and it uses them to, and analyzes the proteins and collagens to try and provide a biological identification or a taxonomic identification. And so we had a couple of weird things come back, and this was one of them, which was distinctly not a bovid, and definitely an ostrich, which is really cool because it demonstrates that, you know, ostriches potentially were also being hunted and consumed, or their bones were also of importance during the mid-Holocene. And if anyone here has ever kind of looked at ostrich bones, and especially the leg bones, if you know, they're quite, unless you have the different ends where they articulate with the other bones, the shaft part is quite similar to a bovid. And that's because ostriches are, you know, running along on their legs, they're big, powerful, muscular, etc. And so there's probably quite a lot of misidentification that's happening. But this is a really cool, you know, really cool find for us, really unexpected. And again, you very rarely see the identification of ostrich bone in zooarchaeological assemblages. So we thought that was cool, and I you know, wanted to share it with you. The other thing that we see at Grassridge are these marine shell beads, and they're present during both the terminal Pleistocene and the mid-Holocene. And they provide, it's direct evidence that there's a connection with the coast, right? These beads, or these, you know, these gastropods aren't getting up and walking 200 kilometers in a straight line from the coast to Grassridge. Like, that's just not going to happen. So someone collected these, you know, these marine gastropod shells, they fashioned them into beads, and then they made their way to Grassridge, which is really cool because it demonstrates, again, the importance of these objects, the connections that individual people had with them, and potentially the connections between, you know, that they help facilitate or kind of smooth between different peoples. One of the other interesting things that we see is the bead diameter size, which is significantly different between the terminal Pleistocene and the mid-Holocene. And there's no real change in thickness. So I'm going to move ahead a slide here just to talk about it a little bit more detail. So in the mid-Holocene, the bead diameter, or the average bead diameter, is about 4.4 millimeters. And then it's much smaller in the terminal Pleistocene. So you know, the 13,500 to 11,000 year occupation, it's about 3.5 millimeters. And when we compared them statistically, there was a significant difference, which is really interesting. So in order to kind of look at this further and to see, well, you know, is this a real difference, or is this something maybe that happened because of taphonomy? The beads from the terminal Pleistocene are twice as old as the beads from the mid-Holocene. So we looked at bead thickness, and our thinking was that if the beads are getting smaller, at least in diameter, because of a taphonomic process, they're being dissolved, worn away, etc., then in theory, the same process might also affect the thickness. And there's no difference whatsoever between bead thickness between the terminal Pleistocene and the mid-Holocene. So it adds strength to the hypothesis that these differences are a result of kind of cultural preferences. That during the terminal Pleistocene, the peoples at Grassridge were making smaller beads, and that was a conscious choice on their part. All right, so just to kind of put this in a little bit of perspective, so here we can see Grassridge with the star. There's Colwynton, Bonaw, Tivrede, Ravenscraig, kind of just below the escarpment there. And then up here we have Sahonghong and Hamakatuko, and then Mplatasana over there. But one of the interesting things that we see during both periods, the terminal Pleistocene and the mid-Holocene, is the presence of ostrich eggshell beads both here as well as up here, and then the presence of marine shell beads and Necerius beads also up here at Hamakatuko. What's really interesting is that Hamakatuko and Sahonghong are up in the Drakensberg. They're 2,000 plus meters above sea level. Ostriches don't live in that region, right? So because ostriches aren't local or endemic to those regions, that's a pretty strong argument for the ostrich eggshell beads having to, moving up there with people. And there was a paper published recently that was the strontium isotope analysis from a set of beads from Hong and was able to make a really strong argument for those ostrich eggshell beads coming from a whole variety of regions outside of this area. And the other thing to think about there is the marine shell beads coming up to Grassridge, perhaps, around the Great Kai River, which was flowing persistently across this period of time. And then maybe going from Grassridge up to Hamakotoko or Sahonghong. But again, kind of thinking about these things together, it seems like there were connections across this whole region here in terms of looking at the presence of ostrich eggshell beads, the presence of marine shell beads, and how we know that these beads are linked to social connections between different peoples and so forth. Okay, so on to the next slide here, and this is some of the work that comes from the paper that Amy Hatton, myself, Ben Scoville, and Jane Wilkins published. And so in that paper, we were looking specifically at the ostrich eggshell beads from Hamahana, which is right here. And then what we wanted to do, so at Hamahana, they have an ostrich eggshell bead assemblage that dates to about 15,000 years ago. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to compare that assemblage to all of the other ostrich eggshell bead assemblages that we see that also date to this MIS2 MIS2 period. So about 15,000 years ago, kind of maybe 15,000 to about 12,000, 13,000 years ago. So right around that time frame, which is a really interesting time in Southern Africa because it's the move from the last glacial maximum to the Holocene. So things become warmer, there's more moisture, they become wetter. We see the expansion of kind of more, we see massive environmental changes with plants and trees, etc., that are can take on more water. So the background to this map, if you guys have a look down there, if everyone takes a look down there, this is kind of the modern prevalence of ostriches. And so it would have been different 15,000 years ago, but it gives us an indication of, potentially where we would expect to see a lot of ostriches. And if we're seeing those ostriches, then we expect to see ostrich eggshell, and we expect to see, this is a resource that could have been easily collected by past peoples and then used to manufacture these beads. And then what we're looking at here, the little pie charts are demonstrating finished beads to preform. So this is, again, an indicator of potentially where ostrich eggshell beads were being manufactured on the landscape, as well as providing us with an indication of where they're kind of ending up. So sites that have a fairly high prevalence of preforms is an argument for, ostrich eggshell beads are being made at this site. So, for example, Grassridge, I think this is Buffelskloof, etc. And then sites where the finished beads kind of predominate. So not surprisingly, all up here in Lesotho and KwaZulu-Natal, where we don't see a lot of ostriches, etc., we see a lot more complete beads and very few preforms. So this is, I think, a really nice map, and it's really nice to kind of demonstrate a couple of things. One, the importance of these sites for the production of ostrich eggshell beads themselves, and kind of really emphasizing the importance of ostrich eggshell beads, ostrich eggshell jewelry for past foragers during these periods, as well as the, especially for the movement of ostrich eggshell beads across the landscape. In terms of us finding ostrich eggshell beads in locations like Lesotho, like in KwaZulu-Natal here, where there are no ostriches. It's hundreds of kilometers before you find ostriches. And I think that's really cool. I think this kind of demonstrates the importance of some of these sites in the interior that aren't along the coast, and for driving, facets of social connection, or for being drivers in terms of forging and maintaining these really important social networks that would have, helped to keep people connected, and would have helped to, help to potentially act as safety nets. So as a, to kind of repeat myself a little bit here, so beads form components of exchange, exchange items. So bead jewelry, it's supported by a couple of different lines or threads of archaeological geochemical evidence. But it's also important to think of, like, there's a lot going on, right? Beads are not the single or only indicators of social connection. And one of the interesting things to think about are stone tools as and especially stone tool size as being argued to reflect social connectivity. And Alex Mackay and colleagues put out a paper, I think back in 2014, that used different kind of attributes of stone tool style to argue for periods of social connectivity and periods of social fragmentation from, probably, I think, the late Pleistocene onward. And so when we see similar sorts of stone tools across, broad landscapes, it's an argument for there being a connection, a social connection between these different groups and between these different regions. And so, for example, like during MIS2, we think of like the Rawberg and these teeny tiny little microliths, like the Wilton in the Holocene. So these type tools are these assemblages that we tend to see pretty. The Howisson's Port is another great example that we see at lots of different sites across southern Africa at about the same time. So during MIS2, what we're seeing is typically lithic assemblages are dominated by the Rawberg technocomplex, so these microliths, and they're present across southern Africa. So we find them on coast to coast, we find them in Lesotho, etc. So this is argued by Mackay et al. And others that there is a degree of social connection amongst the foraging peoples across southern Africa, and that this was clearly an important part of the technological and social repertoire, and that's why it was so persistent. One of the interesting things that we did with the Hatton et al. Paper is we had a look at the beads, and specifically the bead diameters from this period. And what we see is quite a bit of diversity. So here, what you're looking at is assemblages that have beads that date to MIS2 or complete beads, and that record the different bead diameter. And then the circles, Amy Hatton made this graphic, and she's excellent. So the circles are kind of reflect the average bead diameter size. So we can see up in Hamakotoko, there's a really teeny tiny, the average diameter is 3.1, whereas at Bushman's Rockshelter over here, it's huge. It's, well, relatively huge. It's 5 millimeters. And then it's kind of between about 4, 3.5, 4.5 at the other sites. What we were able to determine is that there is significant variation between the sites. So even though some of these sites are, using the same sort of stone tools, they're using the Rawberg stone technocomplex, there's a diversity in ostrich eggshell beads. And so that's really cool. I think that provides us with, it adds to the complexity of how we're thinking about past peoples and social connections. And specifically with how social connections and kind of diversity in material objects may change depending on the different objects. So the stone tool is probably more limited in terms of you need the stone tools to be able to hunt, to work with wood, plants, etc. So incredibly important. If you don't have them, you're kind of at a pretty severe disadvantage. With the ostrich eggshell beads, there's probably more space for being able to experiment or to change things up. So there's probably more space for diversity, and this diversity may be of importance in terms of being kind of a regional identification, or this is specific to this kind of group, and to help kind of demonstrate diverse group identities within an overall kind of connected community. And I think that's something that's really cool and interesting to think about. One of the other things that kind of is also pretty interesting, and John Parkinson actually brought this up when we were chatting the other day, was these beads the really small ones. So for example, beads are being made at Grassridge, and they're about 3.5 millimeters or 4 millimeters in diameter, and then they're being taken or transported up to Hamakotoko. How do they get smaller? There's no ostrich eggshell or ostriches around here, yet the bead size is really different. So are there, is this something where there's a lot of kind of raw material or kind of preforms are being brought and then they're being finished up there, or is there something else going on? And that's a question that, I think it's a great question, and one that I don't know how to answer at the moment, but it provides, I think, something really interesting to think about, and a really, strong future avenue for further research. So kind of coming to the end of the talk here. And so I talked about, MIS2 and the terminal Pleistocene, but what about the Holocene and the mid-Holocene? And one of the things that is pretty interesting is that we need more regional scale and comparative research on social connections during the Holocene. And I think part of this is because, the LSA, the Holocene archaeology, went out of fashion or wasn't in vogue for a little bit of time there. And there was a much stronger emphasis on more earlier archaeology. But there's a lot of great questions and a lot of great archaeology in the Holocene, and I think it provides a lot of information on how these different components might fit together. So thinking in terms of like the Wilton techno complex, which seems to be present across the majority of Southern Africa during this period, but how does that relate to bead diversity, and what can it tell us about the different kinds of objects and materials and artifacts when we're thinking about social connections and how these things fit together? So, intensification of site use, do bead size differ? And we're seeing, bead size differ with the introduction of pastoralists. And more broadly, like what do social networks look like, and how do they change during the Holocene? How do they compare to social networks earlier, previously in the Pleistocene? And so I think those are some interesting questions that deserve probably more research and a stronger focus. So moving forward, some of the things that we're interested in doing at Grassridge are kind of continuing our ongoing analysis of the lithics and trying to contextualize them with what we're seeing in the beads, and to try and use these to form or develop a framework, or develop hypotheses for understanding social connections both during the terminal Pleistocene and the mid-Holocene, looking at them in regional contexts and looking at how these may have changed with respect to changing environments, etc., changing social pressures, and so forth. So I think looking at more than one data set or more than one kind of artifact is super important, and I think that also sometimes tends to get lost a little bit in the archaeology, where you, especially as you're being trained, you become like a specialist in one thing, and you tend to focus on that pretty heavily. So being able to collaborate with a bunch of people and to get different ideas and try and fit it all together, or put it together, is really really the way forward there. And something else that we're interested in is how, again, kind of how do the results, or how does this information from the Holocene, how can this help us to better understand potentially late Pleistocene social networks? And a lot of this is because the ethnographic and historical accounts don't specifically focus on the social context in which beads were made, how they relate to the broader practices of knowledge sharing, and how and when ostrich eggshell beads are discarded, reused, etc. And then these accounts are also problematic in terms of like they're very specific with the foraging peoples and their historical context. Can they be used? Should they be used to explore the archaeology further back in time? And how do those, when do those connections obviously become hazier and hazier, and more tenuous? And I think that's something that we really need to keep in mind and be present about. So I think there's two parts to that moving forward that I think would be super interesting. One is renewed ethnographic research with some peoples and kind of especially within a community engaged and community-led way. And you know, to focus a little bit more on ostrich eggshell beads, how they're made, social contexts, and how these contexts have changed, not only kind of further back in time, but even over the past, you know, 50 years. And then the other part is really to focus in on the Holocene a little bit more and think about using the Holocene to potentially provide novel insights into how we look at foragers further back in time. Okay, well, thank you so much for your time. I'd just like to acknowledge these institutions and funding agencies for their ongoing support of the research at Grassridge, as well as all the people, you know, Roy and Jill Callaghan, Hermanus Opperman, all of the students that we've worked with and continue to work with. It's as well as the Albany Museum, Ekper and Sarah. You know, they've been this project and this research is it's not me. It is 100% you know, a team effort, and we're much stronger for their collaborations. All right, so unfortunately, I'm not around at the moment to take questions, but if you have any questions, or you know, please feel free to have further, you know, discussion. But if anything comes up, please feel free to email me. There's my email address. And I want to thank you all for your time. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to chat with everyone in the South African Archaeological Society. And it's great to be able to share our findings with you and receive your feedback. And it really helps to make our work more meaningful. Thanks so much.